Hi everybody. Okay, here is the next part of the Twits. I'm sure you've all been waiting for this. So, can you remember, because it's been a couple of days, where we'd left off this story? Have a little think. If you said it involved balloons and Mrs. Twit, you'd be absolutely right. Well done. Mr. Twit had convinced Mrs. Twit she was shrinking and that she had to be stretched. And he did that by tying balloons to her, didn't he? Her arms, her wrists, her hair, her neck, which was very dangerous, and you should never do that. And then he'd cut the string on her feet, hadn't he? After Mrs. Twit had said, "Make sure I'm tied tightly," and off she'd shot into the sky. Well, let's see what happens. Is that the end of the story? Probably not. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she wasn't stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and I'll start to come down." You see what she's doing there? She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got a bit less and she started to slow down. When she'd bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether and she stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she started to come down. It was a calm day. There wasn't any wind blowing at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. Now she began to come absolutely straight down again. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came from miles around to flap and stare at this extraordinary woman in the sky. Mr. Twit, who had thought he'd seen the last of his ugly wife, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of his favourite beer. Silently, though, above his head, Mrs. Twit was floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grizzly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up into the sky. He wasn't expecting that, was he? He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "I'm going to get you for this!" shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she'd somehow managed to hang on to for this whole time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, whacking him with the stick all over his body. Oh, poor Mr. Twit. Well, I say poor Mr. Twit, but he really deserved it, didn't he? He did. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. It's kind of fun, though. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison, and there's not a single window anywhere. State of that garden. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building their house. "Who wants everybody on the street peeping in and seeing what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into, and for letting light into your house. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles, stinging nettles. I always grow things with spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles, she used to say. They keep out nasty little children. Near the house you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side there is the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, and you will hear about them later on. Well, what a horrible looking place that garden and house are. Roald Dahl's right, isn't he? It does look like a prison. No windows, nothing but a door. Oh, horrible. Well, I hope you enjoyed that part of the Twits, and I will be back tomorrow with the next part. Have fun with your home learning. Keep it up. Bye.